Hello and welcome everybody. Today we are going to be talking about solving compound inequalities. So your goal after watching this video should be able to solve and represent on a number line the solution to compound inequalities using the words and or. So before we begin applying this to the real world, so where do we see compound inequalities come up and what's an example of one? So this immediately made me think of an experience that I had in high school. So I was friends with the center on our basketball team, and I think, gosh, he was like 6'8". I think he was pretty tall. And we went to Six Flags. Now, I grew up in Massachusetts, so this was Six Flags New England in Western Massachusetts. And I think it's called something else now, but they had a ride called Superman. And it would go like 70, 80 miles an hour, something like that. As you can see, very steep drop. Fun, fast, just your, standard, very large roller coaster. And I was going on, and Corey, the center on our basketball team, was in my group of friends that we were also going on that roller coaster. And he actually wasn't allowed to go on. And I never thought of this before until that time. Normally you think of you must be this tall to ride. So have you ever seen that comedy sketch? I think it's Kevin Hart and Jimmy Fallon. Kevin Hart's too small to ride the roller coaster, right? So you have to be a certain height to get on, but you don't think about what if you're too tall. So this particular roller coaster goes underground and it gets close to other loops, and basically they didn't let super tall people go because if you're raising your hands and stuff, if you're beyond a certain height, there's a possibility that if your hands are fully extended, you could hit it on something. So that was the issue that Corey ran into, and that's also an example of a compound inequality, because not only do you have to be greater than a height, you also have to be less than a certain height. So basically a compound inequality is just talking about when you take two inequalities and put them together. So the roller coaster example, again, greater than a certain height to ride, but also less than a certain height to not have your arm chopped off when you're on the ride as well. So there's a concrete example of one. There's a lot of them out there in the world because we're often talking about multiple conditions that need to be met, but that's what we're going to kind of ground what we're starting in today. So our definition for today, our word is compound inequality. And we define this as two inequalities joined by the word and or the word or. So I think one example would be if we had something, I don't know, x is greater than or equal to -4 and x is less than 3. We're putting both of these things together. Another way that you might see these represented is they just kind of put them together, just smush it. And it is 8 is less than 3y minus 7 is also less than 23. So we're seeing this is another example. And the way that you want to look at these is just break them down. It looks scary, but it's not. Here's one problem. So 8 is less than 3y minus 7. That's not too scary if you look at it like that. And then a second one that we can look at is 3y minus 7 is less than or equal to 23. And again, putting both of these together would be an and inequality. So taking a look at these, again, there's notation can be tricky sometimes, but the skills, in this case, nothing to be scared of, nothing that you haven't seen before. So basically you're just solving two inequalities and putting their graphs together on a number line. So first, isolate the variable to solve the inequality. Next, graph the solution. And then finally, combine the graphs to represent the compound inequality. So the only new step today that you haven't probably seen before is putting two graphs together to make a compound inequality. But the solving and the graphing of inequalities hopefully should be a little bit of review. And if not, reach out, we'll help you. We'll make sure that you can get through step by step. So go through some examples. We'll do an and one first, and then we'll do an or one after. And actually, I want to start off with number 2. So number 1, I feel confident that we'll be okay being able to graph that one. So let's try number 2. Hopefully, this one will be a little bit more helpful. So whenever we see a compound inequality, you're solving two equations. So we should see work for two equations just right off the bat. You should know that right away. So this one, my algebra line, to make sure I'm keeping balance. 2x and 3, and then some division. We're left with 3/2 or 1.5. Either way is fine with me. All right, let's go on to our second inequality. I'll do it in a different color. -1, -1, so minus 3x less than or equal to -9. And this is the step that I'm guessing, as an Algebra 1 teacher, a couple of us might forget. If you have multiplication or division by a negative number when solving an inequality, and I'll highlight this, you need to flip your sign. So we are dividing by a negative on this step, so my sign flips. I used to call that, when I was teaching Algebra 1, I would call that my star step, because I would put a star next to it, because I'm like, oh, I am dividing by a negative. I need to flip my sign. So that's my star step there. That's how I like to refer to it. And again, dividing or multiplying by a negative, flip your inequality. All right, so now it's time to graph. So I did step 1 and 2. I isolated my variables, and now time to move on to my graph. So I'll do my graph in purple for the first question. And this graph was, that is probably not helpful, a little bit too thick there. So we start off at, let's say, 1.5, 3/2. We'll put it right there. It says less than, it's an open circle because it's not or equal to, so just less than 3/2. Okay, my next one, we are moving on to here. And actually, I should do that in the matching color. I'll do it in green. If we start off at 3 this time, and we are greater than or equal to, so we fill in our circle. And what we're going to see here is that our joint number line coming together is going to represent both of these in the same space. So if we have 3/2 here, we go to the left, and then if we start off at 3, filled in circle going to the right, so our full solution would be right here. So this answer is asking us, and let's take a step back to think about this for a second. It's asking us for a number that's both less than 1.5 and greater than 3. Is that possible? Is it possible to be less than 1.5 and greater than 3 at the same time with the same number? No. So there is no solution for this one. This doesn't exist. We're looking for an and. We'd want to see like an interval, maybe some numbers that would work to satisfy both conditions, but in this case, not possible, does not exist, D&E. So there is no number that can satisfy both of those conditions. And that's okay. Sometimes that happens, that we have solutions that don't work perfectly. All right. So that's kind of the steps to go through. So just make sure that when you're answering these questions, you're thinking about, once you actually solve and go through the steps, does this logically make sense? If you see an or solution, like the bottom two down here, and again, sorry, just kick me out of that. So if you see an or solution like our bottom two down here, the answer up top would be totally fine, because or only needs to meet one of the conditions. So it's like, oh, it could be less than 1.5, or it could be greater than 3. Either of those are okay. Any number in that range would be acceptable. But if it's asking for an and, it has to be both. It has to be able to meet both conditions at the same time. All right, so some things to think about with inequalities today. The biggest thing that I would say is just solve 2 questions, put 2 graphs together. Don't make it any harder than it needs to be, as long as you start off there. Even if your answer is a little bit confusing, that does not exist one that we just did together. As long as you're showing the work for solving both and for doing some graphing, you're definitely going to be in really good shape. As always, any questions, let me know. We're here to help. And